Welcome to the Marconi Project, an oral history series of the Italian American Museum of Washington, D.C. In these interviews, we capture the memories and experiences of Italian immigrants and Italian Americans in the nation's capital. We are ready to hear your story.
Good morning. Today's oral history interview for the Marconi Project at the Casa Italiano Social and Cultural Center is with Vito Tanzi. I don't know whether to call him Dr. Tanzi, Professor Tanzi, or Ministro Tanzi. I don't know which title to give him, but let me thank you, Vito. We know each other for almost 50 years, so I will call him Vito, but he's either professor, doctor, or minister, whichever you choose to call him. Vito has had a very distinguished career. He started his profession, let's say after he finished school, teaching at economics, and was chair of the economics department at the American University here in Washington, D.C. He then worked in very senior positions at the International Monetary Fund for about 30 years. He was subsequently made vice minister of economy in Italy in 2001, 2003 under, I guess it was the first Berlusconi government? It's the second Berlusconi government. And in addition, he has lectured worldwide on the subject of fiscal and public finance issues. He consulted with many international institutions, and in fact, we overlapped for a few years at the Inter-American Development Bank. He was a consultant for the IDB, and I was still actively employed there. In addition, he was president of the International Institute for Public Finance, which is a very prestigious position. He has written a number of books. He's going to give us some of those in Italian, covering various aspects of fiscal and public finance issues, and what he mentioned before, the role of government in the economy, which is a very good book. It's also available on Amazon. He has written two books focusing on Italy, which I will ask him about later on in the interview. One of them I got here, Dal miracolo economico al declino, question mark. Vito was born in Mola di Bari in southern Italy and immigrated to the United States in 1956. He did his undergraduate studies when he came here at GW. He went on to Harvard University, where he got his MA and PhD. He's also received honorary degrees from a number of universities in various countries, Argentina, Italy, Portugal, and Belgium. He was made by the Italian presidency Commentatore della Repubblica. That's another title I could call you, Commentatore. I could say much more about Vito, but we're here to listen to him and not to me. So let's start from the beginning. Since this is about Italian Americans in Washington, D.C., we're interested to know, why did you immigrate, your family immigrated to the United States, and why and when, and how did you find the Washington area? So we'll give you an opportunity to introductory comments.
My name is Vito Tanzi, and I was born in Italy and in 1935.
Okay, Vito, so tell us about.
Well, maybe I should start from the beginning.
Yes,
it's always a good place to start.
That's absolutely, that's the whole idea.
I come from a family, middle-class family in Mola di Bari. All my family had a property, I was never poor in the classic sense. But my family had a shipbuilding yard in Mola di Bari, an important one. They made a large fishing boat large enough that went over the Mediterranean. They went fishing to Africa, to what is today Israel, etc. And, just before the war, there were strong incentives for Italian to invest in Africa, in Eritrea, in Somalia, And my grandfather, who owned some of these large fishing boats, transfers some of these boats to Massawa, which is a seaport in Eritrea. And my father moved there to open a shipping yard in Massawa, to build boats in Massawa. And this was in 1938-39. Then immediately after the war came, my father was taken prisoner in Africa And for several years, we didn't even know whether he was alive or not. And my grandfather's boat were sank, were destroyed. And so then my father came back to Italy in 46 or 47, 46. And, the situation in Italy at that time was not very good. And a large part of what they own had been lost, And so for a while, my father was there, and, the shipbuilding started its activity, but was very slow at that period. And eventually, my father had a cousin in Washington, was in the building business, and my father, having built boats which were made of wood, essentially was easy for him to transfer the activity from one to another. So his cousin invited him to the U.S. He eventually applied for a visa, and we got it, and we moved to the U.S. in 1956. I should say that while I was in Italy, I had gone to a special school, which was a very, very good school, a very elite school, which was Istituto Nautico, which was the school where you train to become a commander.
Merchant Marine, we call him Merchant Marine.
Yeah,
here.
Merchant Marine.
My nephew teaches at Merchant Marine Academy in New York.
So I had gone to this school, but then when we decided to move to the U.S., then we moved in May, the end of May of 1956. The question was, what I should do. So I registered at George Washington University, and when I was in Italy, after getting the diploma from the Nautico, I had gone to register to the university. I had started taking courses in law and in economics, and I liked economics very much. So when I went to GW, I registered for economics. During the summer, that summer of 1956, I went to a school that I don't know whether it exists anymore now. It was called Americanization School. Was on Columbia Road, and was a school mainly for immigrants, new immigrants, from all over the world. You went there, and there were people who trained you in English. That was only training, Was a very nice school, just next to where now there is this big hotel.
The Hilton.
Yeah, the Hilton. And so that I had in school in Italy, I had studied both French and English, so English was not completely new to me. And the English I'd learned in Italy, plus the training I got during the summer, allowed me to go to the university in September. So I started George Washington, and I registered in economics. And GW was a very international school at the time. There were a lot of students from Iran. I became very, very close to a friend to the son of the ambassador of Iran, and somebody who became prime minister of Iran immediately after the revolution. And anyway, so I started studying economics, and while my father had this building activity, was a small activity, but allowed us to live decently. There was, I don't recall having any financial problems, and I finished the 4 years in 3 years. I got my BA in 1959 with special honor in economics. I found economics relatively easy for me, and then immediately, as I finished the BA, immediately I was one of my professor. His name was Wilson Schmidt. He died, by the way. It's a tragic death. He died of fire in a fire at the Cosmos Club. He smoked. He was staying there overnight, and he was smoking, and the cigarette, the thing got fired.
By the way, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury.
Yeah.
I was there when he died. I know who he is, and I know how he died.
Yeah, his father was also prominent in the Republican Party at the time. But Wilson Schmidt recommended me to a group in the Joint Economic Committee in Congress that was making a study of the challenge that was coming from Russia at the time. At the time, in 1959, Russia was growing very fast. They put us as a Sputnik in space. There was a lot of worry. The steel production in Russia was higher than the U.S. So they had put together this group headed by a professor at Harvard called Otto Eckstein, who was one of the superstars at Harvard, was the youngest professor of economics at the time. And anyway, I was hired by this group to be an assistant to the director, to Otto Eckstein. And I contributed. There were some very prominent economists at the time in this group. Charlie Schultz, you probably remember. Triffin, you probably remember. Triffin, John Kerrigan. They were very prominent economists in this group. They produced a report that by the time the report was completed, Kennedy won the election, and this became an important report, according to Sorensen, for Kennedy. So that when this report was done, then I was recommended for another group that was called the Outdoor Recreation Resources Review Committee. Was a congressional presidential group, that to study what to do with the public parks, with public lands in the U.S. The U.S. government owns a huge amount of land. At the time, was not quite clear what to do. This group made a study that I was told later on by people in the field that became very important in determining what to do with the national parks and so forth. Anyway, while I worked 2 years for this group, and I also did a master's degree at George Washington in the evening, so I was doing full-time job during the day and taking courses at night. So by 1961, I had the first master's degree. At the time, I applied for going for PhD, and I applied in various universities. And I remember I had been recommended to go to Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins had given me a scholarship to go there because one of the most prominent person in the area I wanted to study was Richard Musgrave, was teaching there, and I was told that was the best place to go to learn public finance. But by the time I was going to make the decision, Musgrave left Johns Hopkins and moved to Michigan at the time. So at that time I had applied. I had also been accepted by Harvard, Yale, and some other place. So the advice was go to Harvard. At the time, I must say that the importance of this decision were not clear to me. I was still naive coming from Italy. I didn't quite, to me, the difference between Michigan and Harvard didn't mean all that much. Anyway, I went to Harvard, and then I did all the work. I didn't have much problems with the work. 2 years later, I passed the comprehensive for the PhD. When you pass the comprehensive for the PhD at Harvard, they give you a master's degree because many people never do the right. Dissertation. You didn't. They became all but dissertation. So I got a second degree. But by that time, Otto Eckstein moved to Washington, the Council of Economic Advisor. So I came back to Washington, and I worked in a project at George Washington for NASA. The NASA at the time was very important, and they tried to justify lots of money that was going into research on the ground that this money would be important also for the economy. So I worked on this project at GW, and then while I was doing the dissertation, and Otto Eckstein was in Washington again. And then I finished the dissertation. I passed. I got a PhD. I finished in 66, but the PhD was in 67 because by the time I finished the dissertation they had already given for 66. So at that time, there was an Italian at American University called, you knew Frank Tamagna?
Sure, of course.
Frank Tamagna, I got one day a call from him, and he said, would you like to come and teach at American University? And they were willing to promote me with the tenure from the beginning as an associate professor. So it was a good offer, also because by that time I was married. My wife was a French employee at the embassy, so to be in Washington was convenient for me. I didn't want to leave Washington, and So I went to American University, and I was promoted to full professor a couple years later. I became a chairman of the Department of Economics. I published lots of papers in those years in an important economic review. And then one day I got a call from the IMF, from the director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the fund, who was a rather well-known economist. Richard Good was his name, asking me if I was willing to go there and to be head of the tax policy division of the IMF. When I got the phone call, I still remember precisely, because the phone call came in the hospital where my wife had just delivered our third child in the hospital, and we were just about to go to Italy on a sabbatical. I'd already got sabbatical from the university. So I told him I would go to the fund, but after the sabbatical. So we moved to Italy in January 74, and we stayed there for about 9 months, and we came back to Washington. And then I took leave from the university, and I went to the IMF. Eventually I resigned from the job from the position at the university. I liked the international environment of the IMF. In 7 years later, I was promoted to the highest level in the fund, which is the director of the Fiscal Affairs Department. I was the first Italian director in the IMF at that level, the first Italian. I was the first Italian to get a PhD from Harvard also. And so I moved to the fund, and I spent there 27 years. And then I retired at the end of 2000, and immediately after retirement, I was invited by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to go there as a senior associate. So I moved there with the idea of spending the rest of my active life doing research, which was what I had wanted to do anywhere. At the fund, I always published, but I always had to do it on weekends, late at night, and so forth. So I went there, but one day I got a call from Tremonti, who was telling me Tremonti would become the Minister of Finance of Italy, saying that we are running the election, most likely we win the election. If we win the election, would you be interested in coming the Italian government? And I thought it was just one of those calls that I would never hear again. And I said, well, in principle, would be interesting, So, but then they won the election, and immediately after, I got a call telling me that, if you want to come to Italy, you have to be there in 3 days because of the swearing in of so they had made me Undersecretary for Economy and Finance. So at the time, I had a problem because I did not have the Italian passport, because I had received in the early 90s, there was a law in Italy that for a few years allowed the former Italians to reacquire the Italian citizenship. Otherwise, you could have only one citizenship. So I had applied. At the time, I knew the Italian ambassador, Biancheri. I don't know whether
I know.
And he had told me about this. So I applied, and I got the citizenship. But I never got the passport. There was no point. At the time, I had the red passport of the UN from the fund. So I rushed to the Italian embassy. The Italian proved that they could be very, very efficient when they wanted to. They produced me a passport in 2 days, a diplomatic passport.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
in 2 days. So I went to Italy, and I swore in, and then I became Undersecretary for Economy and Finance. So I was there for a little bit over 2 years. I must say it was very interesting. I saw how the Italian government worked from inside, but it, to some extent, was disappointing because
We'll get back to that, Vito, if you allow me.
Go back interrupt me whenever.
This is an excellent overview. In other words, you took us almost to the end of your career at 30,000 feet. Let's go back and dig down a little bit in some of these interesting experiences you had. First of all, when you came to Washington, did your parents, maybe not you because you were too busy going to school, working, studying at night, What was there any connection to this community, the so-called Holy Rosary Italian community?
Yeah, it's very strange, but they were. My parents had some contact with the 2 or 3 families, which happened to be from my hometown, and that was the connection. They were from Mola di Bari. They had known them in Mola. They had, so they had some connection. Most of these people lived in Maryland, out in the Silver Spring area. My parents built a very nice large house, quite a distance from Washington, on Route 29, where Burtonsville is. I don't know whether you know where it is.
Sure.
It was about 16 miles from Washington. So it was a distance. So they continued socializing with this Italian family. But outside of those, none. At the George Washington, where I'd gone, I remember there were only 2 Italians that I remember. One was Maurizio De Martino, was from Rome, and there was a family. They had a beauty parlor. And the other one was the son of somebody at the Italian embassy. His name was Ciro Tognetti, if I remember. But I really, for some reason, I never had any contact with the Italian community. Maybe because of the distance where my parents lived. Coming here would have been a long distance, or because nobody ever contacted me. All the environment where I was were always either international or American, like the Senate, and so there was this link for a reason which is for me now it's difficult to explain, and was never a choice on my part. Was just the way things work. The fact that I was always very busy, as I said, when I was at George Washington, I was working full time during the day, going to the university at the night, doing a master. Before that, I finished the BA in 3 years instead of 4 years. I was always very, very busy, so I never had much free time. And also the fact that my first wife, who unfortunately died, she died young of cancer. She was French and not Italian, so she didn't have much interest in socializing with Italians, and so this has been mainly the reason. I don't know that answers.
No, that answers my question. But a related issue is of interest to us here in this project. The fact that what is referred in the sociology, Italianità. Your Italian culture, your Italian name, your Italian language. Did that help you in your career, both in academia, in the IMF? Some people come to this country, they feel discriminated, they feel excluded, they don't like where you come from, they don't like your name. What kind of reception did you get?
Well, let me make first 2 comments that, even though in Washington, I didn't have much contact with Italians, except for these 2 guys at the university who became my friends. But I remain very Italian. My parents went back to live in Italy after a few years, and so they had how I went there every year. And I always felt very Italian. So I never really. I always felt more Italian than American in many ways, So this is now more directly your question. It's a little bit difficult to answer. I mean, normally I had enough credential because of Harvard, because I had been a good student, because of publication, that my life was relatively easy. But there were episodes when I could identify some discrimination. For example, when I became a director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF, by that time, by far, I had more publication, more background. But my main competitor for that position was, there were 2 competitors, really. One was from the Treasury, being Emil Sanley, probably they were trying, he was pushing to get by, but that was probably not a serious competition. But there was one from inside was an Australian who had hardly any background. And we had a BA in commerce from Australia. He had never published anything, but this was the one that my director was pushing. And in the department when I went there, all the high position in the department had been given to colonials, mostly British colonial, people who had worked in Africa. So in that sense, I felt that was a kind of, I don't know what was discrimination against me or discrimination in favor of these people. The director, the one who had the position that I took over, Richard Good, was somebody from Tennessee, very American, probably he could not visualize an Italian to run a very large department in the IMF, and so in this sense, probably there was, I could feel, but I would be unfair to say that this played a large role in my life. I never really, maybe because I was lucky enough to have had all the strong credentials,
So you finally got the job as an American.
Yeah, not only I got a job, but I was the youngest director in the fund. I became a director, directly jumping one position. And at the time I was the youngest director. So that the position I held for 20 years, and which was made me the most senior director eventually in the fund. This was the highest position of career position.
If I remember correctly, you were after Richard Good, you took the job as an American, because even though
I must say, at the time I was only American. Remember,
fair enough.
So I got the position as an those positions were career positions, were not the appointment by country. In the fund there were two directors, was what they called executive directors, which were appointed by the countries. They got together, but didn't have much power. They did not, they had 3-4 people under them. Or then they were the directors of department, which I had 300 people under 300 people under me. Those were not, but obviously nationality played some role, and the U.S. being a
this time in favor of
being a strong country probably played a role. If I had been at that time, I must say, Italian didn't have anybody at that level, so they could have pushed the position too. But obviously, the American push was stronger than the Italian.
Let's continue with this Italian characteristics of yours, as you no doubt faced many crises in Latin America and the rest of the world. You being head of the fiscal department, every time there was a crisis, it's all about fiscal, right? So you were called in. Did you find that your background, your way of thinking, your Italianità help you in relating to these people?
Yeah,
you found
the answer definitely in I worked a lot in Latin America. In fact, I wrote 2 books, one on Argentina and one on Brazil.
If we have time, I want to ask you about the Argentina.
Yeah, the one on Argentina, by the way, I have. There are 2 versions of it. One was updated recently to the Macri time, but the earlier version was published by Bocconi University in Italian. So that at some point I can give you a copy of that if you remind me. And so in Latin America, definitely having an Italian background was very helpful. In Argentina, it helped a lot, wherever, and also in Brazil, it helped, all the country. I work in Chile, I work in Peru, and but especially in Argentina, maybe more than in any other place, this was very helpful. No?
Argentina's half Italian.
Yeah, she was half Italian. Yeah.
Tell me, while you were at the fund, there were a number of crises in Italy. Were you called upon to deal with the Italian government on these crises, and were you welcomed, or to say, "Oh, this American is going to come over and tell us what to do"?
Well, there are two departments, 2 kind of department in the fund. one which dealt with specialized issues like fiscal affairs, statistics, central banking, and so forth, and one we dealt with areas. So if there's a crisis, like a crisis which involved the need for money, normally it's the area department that deals directly with those crises. But as that book described, 2-3 times I led missions to Italy, fund missions, which were asked to deal with a special problem of taxes. There was a lot of tax evasion, so we went there. Another problem was the control of public expenditure. I would lead a mission which would consist of 5-6 people from the fund with a different background. We would go to Rome, had lots of interview, have lots of write a report, leave the report for the Italian, which they would either read and ignore or read and try to do something about. Most of the time, they read and ignored it. No.
Yeah, but were you received well? I mean, did they?
Oh yeah, well, when you come in the fund was always,
It's not very popular. The fund, by the way, it was never popular in Italy or any other country.
yeah, but no, I don't recall any particular.
You were not given particular entree because you were Italian. In Italy, maybe.
Well, yeah, in Italy, obviously, the fact that I could go to Confindustria, speak Italian to people that sometimes did not speak English, was always very helpful. We went to Naples one time during one of the missions. Naples just declared bankruptcy, and so we interviewed some of the people. Were people who had been professor of public finance who knew my work. Was always, easy. I don't know whether it was easy because I had published a lot of things in Italian and, knew Italian, or was easy because I came from the fund. It's difficult to tell,
I know we're talking about your experience both as an American, as an Italian, but I'm interested in, if you could just briefly share with us, maybe it's not a question to ask in this kind of a occasion, but if you were at the fund today and you were sitting across the head of the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, what would be 2 or 3 things that would really come to mind and tell them what they should do? Just briefly, because then I want to talk about your experience in Italy as vice minister.
To the U.S.
To the U.S.
Well, being a public finance person, somebody, and having been at the head for 20 years of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the fund, I've always worried about fiscal sustainability. And the U.S. has these characteristics now that has full employment. The country has been growing rather well for several years, but still running a fiscal deficit of 5% of GDP, accumulating public debt, which is becoming larger and larger and larger. All the while, it has been has been helped by the Fed, because the Fed has kept interest rate very low. So the debt doesn't look very, very costly, no? But this is, this is a game that you cannot play for too long. So that's one thing that I would worry about. Another worry, and this is in a way is a comment on this current administration, and I don't want it to be too political, but they've really been doing 2 things which are very dangerous. One, they're removing lots of regulations. And, in the U.S., there's this view that the regulations are always bad. Regulation restrict personal freedom. If you didn't have regulation, you could go at 100 miles an hour in the city without worrying. But many of the regulations they've removed are very dangerous. Over the long run, will have a serious impact. And another one, the removal the role of scientists within the government.
Oh, yes.
Michael Lewis wrote a book a couple of years ago that somehow did not attract much attention, pointing out how dangerous this was. Making the personal view of Trump as important as the personal view of Fauci or whatever.
Yeah, we're learning that these days.
Yeah, well, that I see as a dangerous thing. But again, this may be seen as a political statement, and I don't want
No,
to
this
make
is a technical. My question was technical, not political. Okay, well, let's leave the IMF aside, and let's go to.
By the way, if I could just footnote, maybe this International Institute of Public Finance is a world institution,
Sure. Go ahead, say
with a headquarter in Munich, in Germany, but it has about 1,000 members from all over the world, from 60 countries, mostly professor of public finance. And I was president of the. I was again the only Italian who ever was president of that institution. It changes every 3 years.
Vito, before we go to your time in Italy as vice minister or deputy minister, let me ask you about the books you've written and your expertise in fiscal and public finance. I understand that the Italians have made very important contributions to public finance. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because last week we interviewed Luigi Einaudi, and he mentioned that one of the things that he found with his name, he would go to Latin America, and ministers and presidents would bring a copy of his grandfather's book translated in Spanish, asking him to autograph it. Tell us a little bit about the role of it.
Maybe I can give you some information, some recent information, which may, as introduction to your question. I have 2 books coming out, that I've written. Both are important books, that probably they will be the last books I ever write. I'm getting too old. But one will be published by Oxford University Press, and has to do with the role of the government and why the role of government has become much more difficult because of complexity of the laws and complexity of the economy and so forth. So that one. And the other one is an advanced introduction to public finance. I was invited by a big publisher in England called Edward Elgar Publishing, to write an advanced introduction to the field of public finance. It's like a textbook, but at advanced level. And in this both of this book, I've stressed the Italian contribution to public finance, especially in the book Advanced Introduction to Public Finance.
I look forward to reading it.
I pointed out that maybe giving you a very technical side of it, the public finance in the U.S. has always been inspired by the view which says that the government represents the individuals, does not represent the community, but represent the individual. The individual determines what the government should do, and the government should give as much individual freedom as possible to the individual. This is what I call the individualistic view of the state. But there are at least 2 other views of the state which are important in other countries. One was the German view, which is called the organic view of the state. The state exists beyond the individual. The individual are like the water of a river. The individual change, but the state is always the same. And the state is what is important, So this was the organic view of the state. The other one was the Italian view of the state, which is the monopolistic view of the state. The view that the state, the whole government, became a government by one group taking over other groups and imposing themselves to the rest of the population. So if you go look at it from this point of view, then it's very difficult to justify purely individualistic approach to public finance. So that the Italian it had two branches. One the bad one, which is the one I described, the monopolistic one. But there was there was another one which was called I don't remember, the the a government that teaches you how to behave. You know, there's a particular.
That's okay. We understand.
Yeah, particular type name that I in this moment.
Paternalistic.
But yeah, paternalistic. The paternalist. That's exactly. And the paternalistic view of the state, which the state exists, gives you instruction, tells you that you should go to school up to a certain age, you should have vaccination, you should have. So these are totally view, and this second set was very much inspired by the Italian public finance, and then maybe this brings you to Italica, to my book.
Yes, why don't we do that? I was going to ask you later. Why don't you go right to Italica? Because then you've already told us how you got to be deputy minister, and we have about 20 minutes or so. Why don't you tell us about Italica, and then we go back to your time in Italy and tell us a little bit more, and finally you can tell us about this, which is related to your experience. So why don't you tell us about Italica?
Yeah, Italica.
Well, just tell them what is Italica about.
Yeah, about when Italy was going to have 150 years of unification, the anniversary of the unification. I was contacted by a group in New York that they published a review called Idea. Interestingly enough, this group were from Mola di Bari. I'm discovering Mola di Bari has been very important in many areas. I can tell you a little bit.
You know who's from Mola di Bari? The guy who takes pictures? The guy who lives in Virginia? What's the young fella's name? He works with you. He takes photographs for the Casa Italiana.
Giovanni.
Yeah, he's in Virginia. Because when I published an article on this book in Voce Italiana, he came to me and said, "Oh, I'm from Mola di Bari. I've heard about Vito Tanzi." Go ahead.
Yeah, anyway, I was asked by this group in New York if I could write an article for this copy of Idea, which would commemorate the 150th anniversary. At the time, I was not very happy. I did not know anything about Italian unification, only what I had learned in school about Garibaldi as a great heroes, Mazzini, all these people, and this patriotic king that had liberated Italian from the Bourbon. And then I started reading, and as I read, I became more and more interested in the topic. Then I started buying books. I think I bought 300 books.
Wow.
on the Italian unification. I must have one of the largest collection in English, in French, in Spanish. I could read all these languages, which helped, and the more I read, the more I convinced myself that the official version was a little bit biased, if not distort, maybe too strong, but biased, And essentially, it dawned on me that the great hero in Italian unification all came from a little corner of Italy, which was the least Italian of all the corners, was Piedmont. Piedmont, even the name, comes from the French, was a French place where the official language was French. They were extremely ambitious. They could not expand themselves toward France or toward Switzerland, so they want to expand themselves with Italy. Was a very militaristic state, very Prussian, and so, the king, Garibaldi was not even Italian, was born in Nice, and they were all anti-Catholic, they were, and Mazzini was from Genova, and so that, it could dawn on me that, this was a very ambitious, and also it turned out that when they conquered the kingdom of Naples, the king of Naples was only 23 years old, was a nice guy. He had already given the constitution. The mother was a Savoy, and but they made the Bourbon as the great enemies, and so I thought that this was, the more I read about it. Anyway, my book had looked at it from a purely economic point of view, not from a patriotic point of view. And I realized that many of the things that happened were very much against the South. For example, there is this fight against the brigands the brigands was really a civil war. The many people in the South rebelled when they were taken over, and the people from the North, they sent an army of 120,000 people that killed tens of thousands of people. When you get to this level, you are no longer dealing with the individual criminal. You are dealing. So I convinced myself, and the book reflects a little bit of.
Are you saying that it was a virtual invasion of the North?
Yeah, it was an invasion of the. So imagine, put yourself there. Also, there is another angle that the Piedmont had copied the French in many ways, and was a very centralized kind of state where they had lots of rules. They have rules on the color that you could paint your doors. They had the rules on when Francesco Ferrara was a prominent economist at the time, teaching in Piedmont, in Torino, but he was a Sicilian, and he complained that when he had to give the exams, he needed a decree from the king, which had established, this was the kind of thing. So all at once, they take over the south of Italy. They send administrator from Piedmont who could not speak Italian. They spoke this Creole, this kind of mixture of French and Italian. And they impose all these very strict rules on the south. So clearly, many bad things happened. They increased tremendously the taxes on the south because they had to finance this army, and so that's the description in the book.
Very good. Tell us, that I think Cavour was the first prime minister.
Cavour was the first
tell
prime.
Us, tell for the record about his first speech to.
Well,
the
when Italy was unified, he made a speech in the Senate, saying that Italy had been unified, and the speech was made in French. And Cavour, first of all, his name, Cavour, is not an Italian name. His mother was Swiss, Protestant. And when Garibaldi arrived in Sicily, he was received by Crispi. Crispi was Albanian. And so it's, you have this mixture of all, and there was clearly anti-Catholic theme to the whole thing. In fact, one of the reasons for the civil war in the South is that when they conquered the South, they expropriated all the land of the convent and the church. The church owned about 40% of all the land of the South. And this was a kind of welfare state, because all this convent, they would give this land to the poor farmers for very little money, and the farmer could then run thing. But then they expropriated this land and they sold to the nouveau riche, to the people that the Gattoparde gives you some idea.
The Gattoparde, sure. So tell us. So what you just described is what I forget now who said it. At the end of when they finally unified the country, they said, "Okay, now we've created Italy. We have to now create the Italians."
Yeah.
Have they created the Italians yet?
No. It's that's the problem. That a friend of mine from my hometown, from Mola, who became the mayor of Mola, and became a senator in Italy, and became also in the House of Representatives, and he had a degree in engineering from the Polytechnic of Torino. He tells me that when he studied, there were signs that for red, but not people from the South. He still remember that.
Yes, true.
And so.
Yep.
So, and by the way, there is also in the book there is a description of the fact that there was this view that had taken over, which became very predominant in the U.S. If you are interested, read a book called The Golden Gate, and which is a recent book about these racial views in the U.S. that led to lots of discrimination, and this view that the people from the North were more noble, more honest, more hardworking, and people from the South, including the Italian, the Greek, the Jews, and all this, were all criminals, and also this became also predominant in Italy. So the people from the north of Italy became the northern people, and the people from the south.
So we're still working on creating the Italians, I suppose. let's go because we have about
I don't know
about
that.
10 minutes left.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because
Okay, she can wait a few
let's
minutes.
talk about your time. Your time as deputy minister under Tremonti. You've explained how you got there. They called you, so you go. You get your diplomatic passport at the embassy. You show up in Rome,
Yeah.
and they say, "Who is this guy with a diplomatic passport? He's been in America." How were you received? Were you received? They welcomed you, or they saw you as an intruder?
I think if I can think carefully, I don't think it had anything to do with my coming from the U.S. The problem was a different one. That in the Italian administration, the ministers were the guests that occasionally come to visit the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who run the hotel, they're the bureaucracy. The
Direttore generale.
Yeah, they become tremendously powerful. I in that book, I mentioned that when Vincenzo Visco, who was a very leftist minister of finance, left, and Tremonti was a very rightist minister of finance, took over, the direttore generale of that office did not change.
Was it Draghi at the time?
Fortunato.
Fortunato.
No. The Draghi was the director.
Later.
Was the director general of the treasury.
Yeah.
No, but the head of the office of the minister.
Oh, the office of the minister.
Yeah,
No.
I don't remember the specific title, but did not change.
Capo di Gabinetto.
Capo di Gabinetto remained the same. This gives you some idea. And this is the one who had all the power. They knew the law, tens of thousands of law that the people came and when we came there, one thing that I describe in the book that Tremonti had a meeting with all the undersecretaries. There were 5 or 6 undersecretaries, and at the beginning to try to assign responsibilities. We had a discussion about 2-3 hours. After 2-3 hours, his decision was not to assign any responsibility permanently. He gave you the responsibility time per time.
Mm-hmm.
One time I had to go to Argentina during the crisis, and he gave me the delega to go to Argentina. I had to go to Delhi when there was the G20 meeting as the head of the delegation. He gave me the thing. But the danger of that is that this bureaucrat knew that you did not have responsibility, so they didn't pass you any information. So you were totally in the dark, completely. No, I remember being totally embarrassed when a delegation from Japan or delegation from the city of London would come to the ministry, and I was the person who spoke the languages easily. So most of the time I was the one who had to receive them. And they want to discuss issue in which I had received zero information. And that was really the main. So it had little to do with the fact that I was coming with the U.S. It had more to do with a permanent and much more serious problem
that's more serious,
in
I
Italy.
agree. While you were in Italy, it was a time where there was a transition from the lira to the euro. I recall reading or listening to an interview with Minister Tremonti. I think after he left the ministry, and you probably go back in the United States, when it became very controversial, the exchange rate, lira into the euro. And they're still debating about that. That Italy was damaged by the exchange rate because it was overvalued, and the Germans in somewhere were favored. And that when Tremonti was asked, he said, "Oh, I didn't have anything to do. It was this guy Vito Tanzi from the IMF who was responsible for this." What was your role in all of this?
Well, I had two. First of all, when those decisions were made, both Tremonti and myself were not in the government, so they were made by Padova Schioppa, by others. First of all, they were made in '98.
The actual exchange rate?
98, yeah. Because the euro formally was introduced in '99, I think, but physically The physical thing was introduced at the beginning of 2002.
2000, after you, well,
Yeah.
you were already in the government at the time.
In the 2002, in fact, I was appointed the president of the commission which dealt with the transition. By that time, the exchange rate had nothing to do.
Had already been set.
Had been decided 3 years earlier.
Okay, but
So
it was-
Tremonti is totally wrong. But
it's not unusual for politics to be wrong.
but the point is that in fact, that was one of the problems I had with the administration, with this administration, that I was very much pro-European Union, and they were all against it.
Yeah.
You know, they thought it was a disaster, and you know, we had a lot of discussion on that. You know.
Okay, so
So, by the way, on this the wrong exchange rate, you know, there is a discussion in that book that they came with the crazy idea that the exchange rate was totally against Italy, and the euro had created a lot of inflation. Berlusconi cited his mother that she had gone to buy onions, and the price of onions had doubled, and of course that had nothing to do with the exchange rate.
except if you went to a bar and you used to pay milliliter for an espresso, now it cost you €1. So there was some redistribution of wealth as a
There
result.
was, you know, at the time, in fact, there is a discussion in the book, you can read it. I got from the statistics department of Italy the price of all the product, whether, you know, whether there been really much more inflation in Italy. They sent me the price of 500-600 products, and there was no basis for it. You could always find some single item, but for one reason or another, you know.
But why is it? Why is the discussion still going on in some political quarters of coming up with a parallel euro? Because they're all blaming the exchange rate. They lost flexibility. So
People
my
keep
question to you is, what do you think
agreeing.
about the future of the euro? How do you see it?
People keep, you know, the exchange rate, by the way, Italy almost went broke in 1992 when they could devalue, you know, they'd been devaluing. So you cannot blame the exchange rate for, you know, the fixing of the exchange rate came much later. And, you know, you have this nationalistic group now that they think that any restriction that comes from abroad is bad. You know, if we could control all our things, then we would be better off, you know, which is, I think the euro was very important, and I still think that is the way to go for Europe rather than splitting up in small states.
Let me we're coming to the end of our discussions. What is your perspective on Italy in terms of where is the country going economically? There's still this big divide between the North and the South. There's a high youth unemployment rate. There's a massive brain drain from Italy. So what do you think needs to be done? Where's the country going? Then we'll close the conversation.
You know, Italy is suffering from the Argentine syndrome. You know, that you introduce a system, and that system has to adjust with the times, and but you find it very, very difficult to adjust it. You know, and so you have lots. You know. You had this system that an enterprise would hire you and they could not fire you ever. You know, that didn't matter how well or how badly things went for this enterprise. You know, you had all this kind of problem which have not been adjusted. When I go, you know, I always tell the story that I've lived 60 years in the U.S. I've been twice to the municipalities. You know. One time when I married, the second time, we did not marry in the church with my wife, but we married in the municipality. And the second time when my mother was here, she fell in my house. She was 96. She fell and she broke one of the bones, you know, and eventually she died. And I had to sign that nobody had pushed her. Mm-hmm. You know, every time we have a house, we still have a house in Mola di Bari, we go there regularly. Every time I go to Mola, for one reason or another, I have to go to the municipality. Sometimes 2-3 times. For trivial thing, they distribute a thing to separate the garbage. You have to go physically to get them from the municipality and bring them to your place. They discovered that the electricity in my house was still in the name of my father, who died 30 years ago. Almost 40 years ago, actually. 38 years ago. And it's still I had to change and to put in my name. They started putting garbage, they removed the tax on the house and put a tax on garbage. Now there was a problem that my house was divided in 4 different parts, each one independent. So now they wanted me to pay 4 times. All this thing, every time, and that's a problem. The bureaucracy is mind-boggling.
So what you're saying, Italy needs a cultural revolution.
Exactly. That was the conclusion.
Cultural revolution.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
on that note, we end this very interesting conversation with Vito Tanzi, and we hope that Italy does have that revolution and overcomes these what seem to be permanent problems still dividing the country.
Yeah, Italy is a tremendous potential, very smart people. I'm amazed, how smart people. I was maybe adding just one comment on Mola di Bari. I turned out that, the Minister of Finance, Minister of Culture of Argentina in Macri was originally from Mola di Bari. The rector of the Glasgow University in Scotland is from Mola di Bari. The guy who was the head of the Court of Appeal in New York was from Mola di Bari. You find all these very able people, and but if they one time one last thing, and I'll stop there. One time I was at the Cosmos Club, and there was a reception for Giaccone when he got the Nobel Prize in Physics. Giaccone was an Italian man, and I was talking to him, and he told me that he had been invited by the Villa d'Este, this annual meeting at Villa d'Este. They had the hope that he would go there and tell the Italian that he should not leave Italy, stay in Italy. And when he went there, the speech that he made, that made them very upset, was that if I had been in Italy, I would not have become even a university professor.